What ties all of this together is not just violence in the Sahel, it's the fight over African decision-making under pressure. Law, military command, media narrative, and regional institutions are all being tested at the same time. And when those pressures converge in a place like Burkina Faso or Mali, you're looking at more than a national crisis. You're looking at a continental stress test. That is why this conversation matters. If you can see the mechanism, you stop mistaking pressure for accident. You stop reading African politics as chaos. You start seeing corridors, command structures, legitimacy systems, and bargaining positions. And once you see those clearly, you also see the opportunity. Africa's market integration, demographic rise, and security reorganization can still become instruments of strength if Africans control the institutions that convert scale into power.
Afro-descendant Ali, yeah, we writing history. Afro-descendant Ali for the whole world to see. Oh yeah.
Peace, everybody. Welcome back to Afro-descendant Ali. This is another one of those conversations with receipts, context, and the long view. Because what looks like a new round of attacks in Burkina Faso and Mali is not just a security story. It is a sovereignty story. It is a corridor story. It is a narrative control story. And if you miss that, you miss what the whole region is actually forced to fight over. The surface-level version says violence is rising, regional actors are reacting, and outside commentary is trying to explain what the Sahel is becoming. Here's what that actually means. The Sahel is the hinge zone between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, between Atlantic-facing states and inland military regimes, old French security architecture, and a new scramble over who gets to define order in West Africa. That is why every claim, every casualty number, every diplomatic statement, and every media frame carries more weight than it seems on first listen. And that is why I want to acknowledge the original source from official survivor media, because the core instincts in that source is correct. Beneath the noise, there is a fight over who has the right to organize African security, African legitimacy, and African political imagination. That debate runs directly into 2026 because the African Continental Free Trade Area is trying to build a continental market at the same time the Sahel states are reorganizing security and political alignment outside ECOWAS. The market logic is integration. The security logic is fragmentation unless Africans control the terms themselves. So tonight, we're not going to treat these clips like isolated commentary. We're going to read them structurally. We're going to look at law, command authority, media networks, regional institutions, and the geography that makes all of this inevitable. Hold that picture in your mind, because once you see the mechanism, you stop reacting to headlines and start recognizing strategy. Let's get into it.
1937, they attributed most of the buying to 1,255 to the military and allied militia, with the rest blame on Islamic, these guys. Can you imagine that? Like, see the lie, the deception. They thought we are, and I watched the comment section of this post, I realized.
The reference to non-interference is well-grounded, and it goes deeper than a diplomatic slogan. Beneath the surface of that claim is a precise African geopolitical argument. Burkina Faso and Mali are insisting that sovereignty in the Sahel cannot be treated as provisional just because external powers, regional blocs, or media networks dislike the governments currently holding state power. That is the real fight. It is not only about attacks, it is about who gets to decide when an African state is legitimate, when it is unstable, and when outsiders can start managing its internal affairs. Now, here's the layer that usually gets missed. The African Union's legal architecture tried to solve a very old African problem. How do you protect territorial sovereignty without giving a blank check to disorder? The African Constitutive Act carries both the principle of non-interference and the Union's limited right to act in grave circumstances. That tension is not a contradiction. It is the continent trying to protect itself from the two historical extremes Africa knows too well: open external manipulation on one side and state collapse on the other. When you map this on the actual geography, the logic gets sharper. Bamako and Ouagadougou do not sit in symbolic space. They sit inside the Sahel Belt, a transition zone linking Maghreb, the Sahara, coastal West Africa, and transcontinental trafficking and trade corridors. Kwame Nkrumah would have recognized this immediately. Whoever influences this belt influences migration routes, fuel routes, gold export routes, and the political buffer between the Atlantic coast and the desert interior. That's not sentiment, that's strategy. The mechanism here is institutional and informational at the same time. Once Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger formalized their break with ECOWAS and deepened the Alliance of Sahel States, the old regional security order stopped being the only game in town. They didn't just leave a bloc, they signaled that command, intelligence, and diplomatic recognition could be reorganized on new terms. And they moved toward a joint force to back that claim with military coordination. That logic runs directly into 2026. AfCFTA is trying to knit Africa into a single market of continental scale, but markets need predictable sovereignty, protected corridors, and political legitimacy that cannot be switched on and off from outside pressure. If African states can't defend the principle that African political disputes must be settled on African terms, then every road, rail line, customs gate, and mineral corridor stays vulnerable to external veto. That's the full weight of the point, and the record supports it.
Some of them are missing up to now. We can't find out. Some of them were found in Gata. Some of them were videos came out. Where were you in Tanzania where this thing happened? We didn't see you in action, where civilians lost their life. Where were you in the conversation? In Cameroon, a lot of people die. Where were you? You were nowhere to be found in the conversation. This is not the first time human rights.
The move to the Nigerian constitution is the exact right move, because this is where rhetoric meets state power. Section 5 matters because it tells you where executive authority sits. In plain terms, the executive powers of the Federation are vested in the president. So anytime Nigeria is discussed as a mover in West African security, diplomacy, sanctions, or coercive pressure, the question is never abstract. The question is, who controls the executive center in Abuja and what regional order are they trying to preserve? That is why Nigeria is always bigger than Nigeria in West African politics. Abuja is not just another capital. It is the command node of the region's largest population, one of its largest economies, and one of the few states with the scale to tilt ECOWAS from debate into action. Murtala Muhammad understood that Nigerian foreign policy could reshape African outcomes. Bola Tinubu sits in that same constitutional seat today, which means the legal meaning of executive power is not theoretical at all. It is live. Hold that picture in your mind. Nigeria's location gives it Gulf of Guinea access, energy leverage, and a direct stake in the northern arc running toward Niger and the wider Sahel. So when West African crises escalate, Nigeria is not responding from the margins. It is responding from the hinge between coastal capital, oil revenue, customs networks, and inland security pressure. The mechanism here is not just military force. It is the fusion of executive authority, fiscal capacity, and regional institutional weight. And once you see that, the political narrative starts to read differently. Every time commentators speak as though ECOWAS decides in the abstract, they hide the material truth that some member states carry far more demographic, financial, and diplomatic weight than others. Nigeria is the heavyweight. That means constitutional authority in Abuja can become regional pressure in Niamey, Bamako, or Ouagadougou, especially when outside powers prefer a West African order anchored in a familiar coastal hierarchy, rather than a renegotiated Sahel-led one. The present-day line is clear. AfCFTA only becomes meaningful when African executive power is used to deepen African production, transport, and bargaining power instead of recycling dependency through regional gatekeeping. The same constitutional machinery that can be used for pressure can also be used for continental leverage. Knowing that changes how you read every statement coming out of Abuja.
Right, well, this is one of the reasons why I never supported Bobby Wine. Bobby Wine is supported by this group. They back Bobby Wine like nobody's business. When they started this campaign, recently also, they launched a documentary by the same group. They kicked them out of Burkina Faso. Kicked their, NGOs out of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. Because, you see, these people, they have a kind of selective human rights activity.
The point about selective backing is well-grounded, and people need to hear it without the fog. External powers do not back stability in the abstract. They back actors, institutions, and narratives that protect access. Access to mineral contracts, access to airspace, access to intelligence channels, access to diplomatic influence. So when the source points to certain forces being backed aggressively, the deeper argument is that patronage follows strategic usefulness, not principle. Thomas Sankara understood that problem before the language around narrative warfare got fashionable. He understood that once a government tries to redirect sovereignty inward toward national dignity, internal mobilization, and autonomous development, it immediately becomes vulnerable to external isolation and domestic destabilization. That same logic now hangs over Burkina Faso and Mali, not because history is repeating mechanically, but because the structure hasn't changed. Any Sahel state that tries to renegotiate dependency will be tested through pressure campaigns, legitimacy battles, and security attrition. The mechanism here is organizational infrastructure. Backing doesn't arrive as a single dramatic event. It arrives through media amplification, diplomatic shielding, NGO language, sanctions design, military relationships, and the quiet preference systems that decide which African actor is called a reformer, which one is called a spoiler, and which one is called a threat. That is narrative control translated into institutional power. Once a label sticks, money, weapons, and recognition tend to follow it. This is why the Alliance of Sahel States matters so much. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are not simply reacting to insecurity, they are trying to build alternative organizational infrastructure after their rupture with ECOWAS. Passports, joint security language, and block-level coordination all signal the same thing. They understand that sovereignty without institutions is just performance. They are trying to harden it into structure. And that takes us straight into the present-day African strategic condition. The continent is entering an era where demographic weight is rising, continental trade integration is being attempted, and outside powers still want privileged access to African resources and routes. In that environment, selective backing becomes a tool for shaping which African governments can convert sovereignty into long-term bargaining power. That is why this is not a side issue. The tradition
And that takes us straight into the current African strategic condition. The continent is entering an era where demographic weight is rising, continental trade integration is being attempted, and outside powers still want privileged access to African resources and routes. In that environment, selective backing becomes a tool for shaping which African governments can convert sovereignty into long-term bargaining power. That is why this is not a side issue. The tradition they built is not a museum piece, it's a living framework.
Of 1,837 people that you claim that they die, the military is responsible for 1,255. The rest is for the T group. If this is true, why is Burkina Faso, the people are not protesting on the street? No, it means you are lying. They always come out with a claim that, they cannot back. Now, this is the reason why they put this out by this time.
When the conversation turns to the military and responsibility, the constitutional question becomes even more important. Casualty numbers do not float in the air. Armed force in a modern state is chained to command authority, budget authority, and political authorization. So the move back to Section 5 is sharp because it reminds the audience that security violence is not just something the military does on its own, it sits inside executive power. Here's what that actually means. The moment a government deploys force, tolerates force, or narrates force, it is making a political decision about legitimacy.
Olusegun Obasanjo knew from both military and civilian power that command is never purely technical. It is constitutional, it is bureaucratic, it is territorial, and it is always tied to the image a state wants to project about order. That is why numbers matter so much. Numbers are not just records of death. They are weapons in the battle over who gets blamed, who gets excused, and who gets to govern next. Now look at the geography. In West Africa, military responsibility is never contained by neat borders because the insurgent space is regional while the legal authority is national. That mismatch creates a permanent opening for confusion. Fighters move across frontier zones, narratives move faster than investigations, and international reporting collapses multiple theaters into one storyline. And the ordinary audience is left reacting to shock instead of tracing chain of command. The mechanism here is information discipline. Whoever can fix a casualty figure to a state actor or shield a state actor from that figure shapes the diplomatic environment that follows. That affects aid, intelligence partnerships, sanctions debates, and the political room available to governments in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Abuja. So the real fact check is not just whether a number was spoken, it is whether the audience understands the legal and institutional pathway that turns violence into policy. That logic runs directly into Africa's demographic century. A young continent cannot afford security systems that consume people, destroy trust, and then disappear into constitutional fog. The workforce growth coming out of Africa will either be an engine of strategic power or a reservoir of instability, depending on whether institutions can convert population into disciplined state capacity. That is why accountability is not a moral add-on, it is part of nation building under pressure. The point about local journalists together with international journalists is one of the most important lines in the entire source, because that is the machinery. News does not move randomly, it moves through networks. Local stringers, foreign bureaus, NGO briefs, embassy chatter, platform algorithms, and think tank framing all help decide which African event becomes a global emergency, which one becomes a quiet footnote, and which one becomes a morality play with pre-assigned villains and heroes. Frantz Fanon would have recognized this immediately. Narrative control is not a side battle that happens after the material battle, it is part of the material battle. If the story says the Sahel is hopeless, irrational, and permanently in need of outside management, then outside management becomes easier to fund, justify, and normalize. The audience has already been prepared for it. That is why media convergence matters so much in a contested region.
Ibrahim Traoré was granted an interview and he exposed them on that interview. The local journalists together with international journalists, they asked him critical questions and then he exposed them. And then the flamer, because he's in the news. On the Francophone chat like this, Ibrahim Traoré is trending because of this particular interview. So this is the best time to put this out. This is not the first time they have been doing this. It's like a campaign. They'll bring it and then when the people are not buying it,
Now here's the layer that usually gets missed. The source's own geopolitical expansion line points to infrastructure, debt, minerals, ports, and food corridors being reorganized. That is not exaggeration. The inland Sahel depends on access to coastal transport systems and external finance, while the wider region is being pulled by competing trade and logistics visions. The Gulf of Guinea is not just a backdrop, it is the maritime outlet for the political economy of the interior. Whoever shapes the narrative around insecurity also influences who looks safe enough to control the corridor. The mechanism here is information networks tied to economic networks. A media frame can affect investor confidence, diplomatic tolerance, insurance costs, and aid conditionality. Ultimately, whether African states bargain from weakness or from organized leverage, that is why AfCFTA matters in this conversation. It is not only about tariffs, it is about building the institutional space where African trade, African logistics, and African digital problem solving are organized more from within than from without. That is the present day line. If African states do not build their own narrative infrastructure, then even their most important economic projects remain vulnerable to outside storytelling. A continent trying to turn scale into power cannot outsource the description of its conflicts, its leaders, or its commercial future. Knowing this changes what you build and how you build it.
Bring it, and then when the people are not buying it, they will hold on. They'll wait when Traore is about to get in the news and they know that this is the trending time, then they'll pull it out. And then when the people don't buy it, they back off. They are looking for a way to get to the people. Same thing Gaddafi suffered in their hands.
The reference to training and then pulling something out is a familiar pattern, and the source is right to treat it cautiously. The structural reality here is simple. Temporary security language often becomes a bridge into durable influence. Training missions create habits of dependence. Intelligence sharing create channels of leverage. Equipment pipelines create maintenance dependency. Before long, what was presented as assistance starts functioning like architecture. That is why the ECOWAS peace and security language matters. Regional security treaties sound neutral on paper, but their real meaning depends on who commands the institutions, who funds the operations, and whose strategic interests are being protected when the language is activated. Julius Nyerere would have recognized the danger of institutions that speak in African terms while operating through external logic. The text may promise stability, the mechanism may still reward dependency. Look at the institutional pathway. ECOWAS built an early warning and response framework around its peace and security mandate, and that system has existed for years as part of the region's formal architecture. So when people hear a phrase like training, monitoring, stabilization, or intervention, they should not hear isolated words. They should hear an institutional chain: surveillance, reporting, recommendation, decision, deployment. That's how rhetoric becomes power. And now that chain is being contested. The Alliance of Sahel States is trying to build a separate security pole, including a joint force, while Russia has publicly backed that effort after the retreat of older Western military arrangements. In other words, West Africa is no longer arguing inside a single security grammar. It is splitting into rival grammars of order. One says, restore the familiar hierarchy. The other says, build a new one from the Sahel outward. That is not a historical footnote. It is the security version of the same question AfCFTA raises on the economic front. Will Africa coordinate from a position of internal design, or will it remain a field where outside actors keep reorganizing the map? Add Africa's rising workforce and demographic scale to that equation, and you can see why every institutional decision being made now carries generational weight. He got there first. What ties all of this together is not just violence in the Sahel, it's the fight over African decision-making under pressure. Law, military command, media narrative, and regional institutions are all being tested at the same time. And when those pressures converge in a place like Burkina Faso or Mali, you're looking at more than a national crisis. You're looking at a continental stress test. That is why this conversation matters. If you can see the mechanism, you stop mistaking pressure for accident. You stop reading African politics as chaos. You start seeing corridors, command structures, legitimacy systems, and bargaining positions. And once you see those clearly, you also see the opportunity. Africa's market integration, demographic rise, and security reorganization can still become instruments of strength if Africans control the institutions that convert scale into power. Much respect again to official Survivor Media for the source that pushed this conversation forward. Stay locked in. This channel is about conversations with receipts, context, and the long view. Much love to everybody in the stream. I'll see you in the next one.